So I gathered together some images to kind of walk us through what's going on. Sometimes the images are there to prompt me, so I remember what to say. Again, I want you guys to feel free to comment on anything you like as we go through this. So let's get started, I reckon. So, good evening, everyone. Behold the adorable and usually harmless rat. I figured this would be a cutesy way to get going. I'm sorry if it terrifies you. I tried to pick the least offensive picture of a rat that I could find. Quite smart animals, actually. Let's go ahead and jump into the story. So also, you guys probably at least looked at the study guide, even if you didn't get a chance to get through everything in the book. And one characteristic that you will notice as you're reading is that there's this shift in perspective from the internal, well, let's say the journalistic musing of the narrator, where he kind of has a little heart-to-heart with you, the reader, and it's in a journalistic style. And then it shifts to what seems to be a third-person perspective. But it's actually still the narrative. And it's interesting how that's pulled off, because it's written as if it's not. But you'll notice, okay, maybe I'm skipping ahead a little bit. You'll notice, or pay attention as you read anyway, that the only time you get, let's say, text that's about the internal state of the narrator, it is Dr. Ryu, who is, as it is spoiled in the it's spoiled in the study guide. Dr. Ryu is, of course, the narrator. But you could probably figure that out pretty quickly because as it says right away, that he is someone who is involved in what happened very closely. He's going to use his own personal experience. He's going to use data that he has access to, so that tells you something about who the narrator is. And he's also going to use documents, other documents, including, well, as you see in the first part, the journal of somebody else. So we start off with this small discussion. And by the way, when necessary, I can switch this to the book. I also have the book open here. I'm just going to start off with a bit of a run through. So Dr. Ryu, who is one of the local doctors in Oran, we meet him and we get, first of all, right at the beginning, a bit of a mystery about the date, but it's not much of a mystery. We talked last time about the fact that this book is an allegory to the Nazi occupation of France. And it says in the book, right at the start, that it takes place in 1940 blank. So the Nazi occupation lasted from 1940 to 1944. So this is either during the Nazi occupation or right after. As if they couldn't make it any clearer what this is about. And it never comes up in the book. This is some parallel universe Oran. We start off with a description of Oran. And I mentioned last time that any upstanding citizen of Oran might find the description a bit offensive. It's described as a pretty bleak place. I have some quotes here. The town itself, let's admit, is ugly. It has a smug, placid air, and you need time to discover what it is that makes it different from so many business centers in other parts of the world. So right away, we get this pretty bad characterization of the town. Let me just, okay, there we go. The truth is that everyone is bored and devotes himself to cultivating habits. Our citizens work hard, but only to get rich. Their chief interest is in commerce, and their chief aim in life is, as they call it, doing business. Now, I didn't put among the quotes here. He does give a somewhat positive estimation of the people. He says that people tend to hold them in at least reasonable esteem as nice, hardworking people. But he does describe them as not having, as he says here, intimations. So in comparison to other towns, he says there still exist towns and countries where people have now and then an inkling of something different. The people of Oran are described almost as if they're not awake. They go about their routines building habits. And he says that the building of habits is the key to being happy in Oran. That's really all there is to it. He says, Oran, however, seems to be a town without intimations. So intimation, if you're not familiar with that word, it can mean any revealing of information. But in this case, it's something like without any hints or clues. Hey, there we go. Without any revelations. Right? Now think about this in relation to the story. As we know just from the title of the book, bad things are on the horizon. Those could be considered things that might wake you out of your habits, without a doubt. You would get an intimation when all of your possible activities have been uprooted and turned upside down. He goes on to describe this as, in other words, completely modern. Anybody have anything to say about what is meant here? A town without intimations, a town in which the people just move through life. In other words, completely modern.
Maybe it is when people are, are without contact, just everybody watches its business and that's all.
Mm-hmm.
You know.
That's good. So, yeah, that here...
Without social interaction.
Social interaction?
Yeah.
He does say that people interact.
Yeah, they interact, but, at low level, something like that.
Yeah. He says that they do business, and then they, aside from that, in their free time, they go to the bar, they go to the parlor houses to play cards, and that's it. So there is some social life there, but it is this devotion to, as they call it, doing business that I think he's getting at. Anybody else want to say something?
Maybe a completely modern, relationships between people are cold, without much feelings. There are social interactions, but without bonding with people.
Yes, that's good. Yeah, cold, impersonal. Yes, Scott? How do I...
I was thinking about it as people, like in the modern world, they're so used to their modern medicine and their modern gizmos and modern peace treaties and everything, that they're sort of like getting lulled to sleep about the realities, like the darkness that's possible in life.
That's good. Yeah, they feel safe. They feel safe inside of inside of this modernity as it's being described here. That's good too. Mm-hmm. Good. Yeah. So these are good insights. Yeah, he goes on to say that the town is treeless, glamourless, soulless. The town of Oran ends by seeming restful, and after a while, you go complacently to sleep there. I'm going to bring in just a little outside information about. There's a concept that Camus is into. He calls it somnolence, and it is basically being asleep or not living a life that's awake. Let's see. Hang on a sec. Oh, there we go. So this could be seen as a reference to specifically that as well. Let me just trying to organize this video bar. Just a sec. Okay, that works. All right. So yeah, intimation, hint, clue, revelation, no intimation, completely modern. I should have switched the slide to this a second ago. This is what we were just talking about. Ennui, I figured I'd throw in a good French vocabulary word here. This is a word that is used in English, and it is, I think, one of probably the most French words out there, just because not only is it ennui, a French word, it describes soul-crushing boredom. There is a point in that description where he says that people are bored. Actually, yeah, I did include that as one of the quotes. So I gathered together pictures of people that looked somewhat like somewhat like the characters. Let's talk about the characters. Dr. Ryu. How would you characterize him? Dr. Ryu, I almost threw in a picture of the Japanese Ryu, like very bold of him to choose a traditional Japanese name, like R-Y-U, Ryu. Dr. Ryu. How would we characterize Dr. Ryu? Anybody want to describe Dr. Ryu? He's for those of you who haven't had a chance to read, maybe you got busy. Dr. Ryu is, as I said before, the narrator. He's the main character. He's central to this whole thing. Yeah, how would you describe him?
I would say that he is hardworking, persistent. He is curious about that plague that happened in city, and he's looking for it. He's talking with a lot of people about that, and you know, in the middle of first chapter, he found out that it is plague. What they are talking about.
Diligent.
Diligent, yes, also.
Good. Yes, he does want to know about the plague. What else have you guys noticed about him? For example, I kind of hinted at it last time, how he tends to be cautious but realistic.
Yeah.
So he's very, let's say, level-headed.
A straight shooter.
He's a straight shooter, yes. Straight shooter, if you guys don't know that idiom, it means that he doesn't like hide his opinions. Hang on a sec. He tells people what he thinks without holding back, even if it's uncomfortable. And that is going to come up for sure. Oh, hang on, I think I have some people to let in, just a sec. Just a sec. Okay. Oh, there's some happening in the chat. Is my audio working? Milica, no, I don't hear you. Is your mic icon doing the green thing that it does? You'll have to pardon me. I'm being very Monsieur Grand, not able to find the right words. Let me see. Where is Millie?
I wanted to say that he has a
for doing what's right. And
Could you speak up? Sorry.
He has a strong sense for doing what's right and like
Yes.
fighting from the true. And we see that when he's talking to I don't know how to pronounce the French reporter from Paris, like
Raymond.
Yeah,
Raymond. Yeah. Most certainly, Raymond Rambert sense for what is right. And what was the other thing that you said?
I don't know, fighting for the truth.
Sorry?
But we kind of have that, I think.
I'm sorry, I can't hear you. He has a sense for what is right, certainly. He...
I think she said fighting for the truth.
Yes, yes.
Well.
That ties with the straight shooter thing, yes. And yes, what is true? Most certainly. And yeah, you notice he also has a doctor's sometimes coldness, let's say. He has a, let's say he's analytic. He has a doctor's analytic gaze. Gaze as in view of things.
He's also realistic.
He's realistic, yes.
Yeah.
Analytic, realistic, definitely. So we meet Dr. Ryu right at the beginning. He gives us a little bit of a heart-to-heart. He's the one who's describing the town. He says he's going to keep his identity secret for the time being, but well, we've already kind of let the cat out of the bag. A lot of people who read this didn't even realize ever that it wasn't Ryu. It's almost pretty obvious, like straight away, even if the, I mean, just think about it because of the fact that he says he's somebody who is close to the situation, who has data about the situation, and and he's also in every scene. Yes, Scott?
For a while, I was thinking it was Grand because talking about he was trying to write a book and he's collecting data about the number of dead people. So I was like, okay, so he's in the system. He knows
that's
things.
True. He does have the numbers. He always comes in waving the numbers around. Yeah, that's the other thing. Very subtly, I was trying to express this properly before. Maybe I didn't get it. You'll notice that when we're in story mode, as opposed to the I'm the narrator speaking directly to you mode, when we're in story mode, the only time we get sense data about the character is when it's him. Something that nobody else could have known, like the squashing a rat right at the beginning as he steps on a rat in the very first scene. And there are other places where that happens, where he says something only Dr. Ryu could know. But when other people have sense data, there's some extra thing attached to the sentence that says something like, he revealed. So he had felt something, and he revealed all this in a conversation. So every time someone else releases some internal or has some text about their internal experience, it's there's something attached to that to let you know that it was intimated by the person in some way. Okay, let's go on to the next. So poor Monsieur Michel. Monsieur Michel is the concierge at this big motel, and he's, I think, emblematic of a lot of people. Straight away from Rat 1, from Rat 0. Monsieur Michel is in a practically unique place in the story to be the very first person to immediately deny that anything's happening. In fact, the first thing we hear from him is, there aren't any rats here. Even though Dr. Ryu runs into him. Dr. Ryu steps on a rat. That's the very first scene. And runs into the concierge. Concierge, by the way, is like the... Is that word in Serbian? I don't know what it is in Serbian. Like the bellman or something like that. I don't know. Anyway, he's basically the guy. He's the head bellhop. I guess that term doesn't help things either. The people who, as you can see in the picture here, sort of see you in and take care of your luggage and all that good stuff. So Ryu immediately steps on a rat. He sees other rats out and about. And we also get descriptions of the rats dying horribly, coming out, sopping wet, coughing blood, doing a sort of little dance, and then falling down dead.
Yes, making pirouette.
Making what? A pirouette, yes.
Yes.
I thought about doing a little thing during this presentation about the dance of death, dance macabre. It's a thing. Look it up. But I figured that would be too much of a diversion for now. Yes, the rats do a little pirouette and then fall down dead. Very concerning. Monsieur Michel, on the second day, finds 3 more rats, and he figures that there are some prankster little rascals around, and he wants to catch them. So he decides he'll just stand there holding them by their legs, as in the quote here. The concierge had lingered in the doorway for quite a while, holding the rats by their legs and keeping a sharp eye on the passers-by, on the off chance the miscreants would give themselves away by grinning. So you can just picture this guy as a bit of a crazy person standing there with a dead rat, just eyeing people, waiting for somebody to smile so that he can say, aha. In retrospect, this is certainly one of the worst decisions Monsieur Michel ever made. Actually, it is the worst decision he ever made. He couldn't know that at the time, but those rats were infected with the plague. He says, but I'll nab him tonight. Or I'll nab him all right, sorry. He says, hopefully. So, as I said, excuse me, Monsieur Michel is emblematic of a lot of people, and a lot of people in the current situation. I said last time, watch out for things that look really familiar. Yeah, I think we could all probably think of people like this who are taking a sort of attitude of this isn't really happening. It's certainly to the level of even being conspiratorially believed that this is all being put on by some mysterious forces. So yeah, and you're going to see as we go through this more people who sound probably familiar to you. So yes, the rat, perhaps the rat in question. Every now and then there's a rat in this presentation. So Mademoiselle Rieu is introduced here. She's going where? Anybody remember?
Rehabilitation or something like that.
Yes, she's going to the sanatorium. She's ill.
Yes, she did.
I think she's going to a banya, right?
She's going to a banya, yes. She's going to the banya where they treat tuberculosis. Yeah, we meet her, and we don't hear anything else about her in the first chapter, but Monsieur Rieu, Dr. Rieu, does see her off to the train, and there's a sad parting scene. You'll notice that at the beginning of many of the story mode parts, it begins with Dr. Rieu doing his rounds. So as a sort of small town doctor, he does rounds where he goes to see regular patients and stops in on other people who need seeing. So he's kind of making house calls, going about. But yes, we learned that his wife is ill and she's going to the sanatorium. She's going to, yes, a kind of a rehab. We meet the Crazy Spaniard. So the Crazy Spaniard is and he's the old asthmatic Spaniard who has retired in Iran, and he shows up a few times in the book. Who wants to say something about him aside from rat expert? I'm saying that facetiously. For those of you who didn't read this, he's not really a rat expert. I'm just being funny. He's one of Dr. Ryu's regulars. He stops by to check on him. And he's like, they're coming out to eat. Have you heard about the rats? People are starting to talk about the rats.
Isn't he like supposed to symbolize like paranoia? Like, I think he has that kind of sole purpose, like representing the people.
Paranoia, or maybe just absurdity. He seems pretty I don't know. I mean, I'm not going to say that there's one ultimate final correct way of interpreting him. To me, he seems very at home. I mean, he later on, I'm going to kind of skip ahead slightly. Later on, he says something like that, like when you retire, you should just set about doing nothing, and that's kind of like his whole philosophy. And it mentions at the end of part 1 that he has all of these bowls and pans full of peas. Correct me if I'm wrong. Yeah. Maybe about this next thing. Maybe they don't say in this chapter that he tells time with him. They just mention that he has peas all around him. Do you guys?
Yeah, I remember that.
Later on, we learn.
I want to say in this context, when he comes like to Dr. Yu, I mean, it's kind of all he does, spreading hysteria, and then like on the end, I know I kind of confuse me with the man who spits on cats.
Yes, that guy is in the diary of Taru. We'll get to him soon. Yeah.
But
maybe...
I remember that he likes him because he doesn't like care, and he just
that Taru likes
faced with the absurdity of the world, and this guy is also like face the absurdity and just lives his life.
That's why I wouldn't say paranoia. Maybe so the thing I was hoping to get at, and maybe you were getting at this too, is that he's certainly one of the first really absurd people that you meet. So absurdity is a theme throughout the book. Now, we talked a little bit about absurdity in the first session. Milica, I don't know if you got a chance to watch the video of the session, the first session. But we talked a bit about absurdity. You have...
I was there, actually.
Oh, were you? I'm sorry. For some reason, I thought you didn't make it. Oh, never mind. See, people weren't talking last time. So he certainly represents absurdity, what with the peas and everything. I mean, if you think about somebody trying to tell the time by shifting peas into a pan and saying, every time the pan fills up, I know that it's X o'clock or something like that. How ridiculous that is, because, I mean, if you think about it for a second, how do you know how often to put a pea in or take a pea out or something? It's just clearly ridiculous. And also, he's quite gleeful about the rats coming out. This is something that he shares with Cotard. We'll get to Cotard in a bit here, where they're both kind of, I don't know, they seem kind of okay with everything that's happening. He gleefully says about the rats, they're coming out, they're coming out. So yeah, that's the first time we meet the Crazy Spaniard. He shows up in a couple of Dr. Ryu's rounds. Interesting character, for sure. Okay, anybody else want to say anything about the Crazy Spaniard here, represented by Salvador Dali? Okay. Raymond, we meet Raymond. Now, you'll find a lot of people out, if you look into discussions about this book, there are people having discussions about who best represents Camus. Most of the time, Raymond does not enter into that competition, as you'll see why a little bit later. But there's a lot in Raymond that is tied up with Camus. I mentioned last time that Camus was a journalist. Raymond is kind of maybe an inverted Camus. Camus was a journalist who wound up joining the resistance. Raymond, on the other hand, he's trying to escape the resistance. Okay, that's me. Let's not skip ahead. Okay. Right now, all we know about Raymond is that he's a journalist. He shows up, and he has a proposal. Who remembers what the proposal is? This is just in part one, not the proposal later on. He wants to, he talks to Dr. Ryu about what?
Hey,
About what?
I cannot remember actually, but I guessed maybe about
Plague.
Yeah.
That's a good guess. That's gonna go on.
Wasn't it that about the situation of the Arab population?
Yes, yes. So, yes, the situation for the Arab population is what he comes originally to speak with Dr. Ryu about. And what does Dr. Ryu say? And this goes to his characterization earlier. Dr. Ryu says what?
Well, he kind of says, like, are you going to actually say what I say, or are you going to
Yes.
soften the mainstream?
Can I be honest, basically? In other words, will you write everything that I say? Unqualified, will you give me unqualified honesty? And immediately Raymond is like, well, I don't know about unqualified. It can't be that bad, is it? Now, as I said, this relates to the actual Camus because, as I mentioned last time, Camus got into some trouble for writing about the bad state of the Arab population under the French in Algeria. So this Raymond kind of chickens out. Will you write what I say? No. I'm paraphrasing, of course. And he's like, I don't know. In the end, they kind of decide not to write that story. Well, he decides not to write that story. So he basically is not going to get himself in trouble or rock the boat, as it were. Now, Dr. Ryu does say, you can write about the rats. And Raymond says, oh, okay, cool. I'll do that. Sounds good. So he sets about to find out about the rats. More and more rats are popping up all around town and dying with a little dance. I put down here the distant love. That's a bit of a hint about what's coming up later. I found this picture and I was like, this is absolutely the perfect picture for Raymond. It even has his distant love that we're going to learn about as the book proceeds. Okay. Does anybody else have anything to say about, oh no. No. Okay, my share is frozen. I'm going to have to try to recover it. Has this happened to you before, Scott? This happens to me sometimes.
What does it look like exactly?
It's that the shared screen cannot be interacted with. It looks fine, and all of you guys should see everything normally. And I found that the way to do this is to try to get to just the share tab and close it and then reopen the share. So if you lose the share for a second, oh, wait. Maybe I have it back now. Okay, let me try that one more time. Okay, I'm going to reshare now.
By the way, was this the part of the book where there was that little wink at the stranger?
That's coming up, yeah. There is a wink at the stranger. Now, that's in the discussion of Cotard. Yeah, we will get to that. That's interesting, too, of course. Who else have we got? So, Jean Theroux. Jean Theroux is someone we meet briefly. Jean Theroux is somebody who is staying at the big hotel. He's apparently a man of means, independently wealthy, just staying in town, visiting. And he has a brief conversation with Ryu, but we get much more of Jean Theroux in the form of his journals in the first chapter. We'll hear more from him later on. But we get Jean Theroux's journals as a part of the first part. I should stop saying chapter. By the way, guys, you've probably noticed that the parts are broken down into chapters, and the chapters are not, at least in my copy, they're not numbered. They are numbered in the study guide. We will refer to them, and sometimes you'll have to use the study guide to see which chapter exactly. So we just meet him briefly. He and Dr. Ryu talk for a moment outside as Jean Theroux looks down at a rat that is dying and says something like, it's an annoyance in the end. Nobody realizes what's happening yet. In fact, Dr. Ryu doesn't really realize what's happening yet. Let me move forward here. Father Paneloux. So a short while later, we meet Monsieur Michel again, and he's not looking so hot. He's kind of limping a little bit. He looks really gaunt. He's being helped along by Father Paneloux, who will be a much bigger part of the story later on. We don't get much of him in the first part, except this little scene where he's helping Monsieur Michel. Dr. Ryu tells Monsieur Michel to go home and rest because he certainly doesn't look like he should be bell hopping. Yeah, we don't know much about him yet. Now, the weather itself, we could say, is a character in the story. Just to tie it a little bit back to Camus' thinking in general, Camus believes of people who are in a state of somnolence, as he says, basically a state of waking sleep, people who are engaged in their habits completely, are not aware of the absurdity of repeatedly doing the same things over and over again, are sort of pushed around like objects. They're unconscious of their condition. And the weather is something that can, I guess one way to say it is the weather in this book sort of tells the people how to feel sometimes, but that's not always the case either. Sometimes the weather is in complete defiance of what is happening with regard to tragedy. So I'll give you some examples. These are not the only examples of the weather being described. So after we meet Monsieur Michel again, a short time later, Dr. Ryu goes to see him, and he's in a very bad state. He has ganglia and buboes all over the place. And they're trying to rush him to the hospital, and on the way there, he dies. And right after that, we get, on the day following old Michel's death, the sky clouded up, and there were brief torrential downpours, each of which was followed by some hours of muggy heat. So you'll find time and time again that the weather is telling us something. This is something that's used by good cinematographers too. The weather, good directors and cinematographers. The weather is adding something. It's, not just the mood. It can be signaling something that's coming along. Hemmed in by lines and lines. So some of these are from different parts of the chapter. Of the part. Different parts of the part. I didn't want to say that. Hemmed in by lines and lines of whitewashed walls, walking between rows of dusty shops or riding in the dingy yellow streetcars, you felt, as it were, trapped by the climate. In that negative description he gives of the town, where he says, you can't tell anything about this town by looking at the town itself. You have to look at the sky. That's the only indication of anything in nature. It sounds like the town's sort of really paved over. There aren't trees or anything, as he said. The doctor was still looking out of the window. Beyond it lay the tranquil radiance of a cool spring sky. Inside the room, a word was echoing still, the plague. That's right after they first use the word, the plague. So here it's used as a contrast where nature is unreasonably unsympathetic. It's kind of, it's going to come up again, where people are going through incredibly difficult and terrifying circumstances. And also some birds are singing and the sun is shining. And this is, one of those circumstances that reminds you of absurdity. That's the point of putting that, right? Of writing it in that way, or at least that's perhaps a good way of saying it. I'm not going to make final pronouncements on what's the good way and what's the bad way. You guys follow me on this?
Yeah.
We talked last time about the unreasonable silence of the universe. It's not that the universe doesn't have, massive chemical reactions and, nuclear explosions happening in the void of space. It's silent in our expectations to explain and justify everything that happens. About this time, the weather appeared set fair, and the sun had drawn up the last puddles left by the recent rain. There was a serene blue sky flooded with golden light each morning, with sometimes a drone of planes in the rising heat. All seemed well with the world. See, there it is again. Everything's nice, the sun is shining, but terrible things are afoot. So we meet Joseph Grand, who is a sort of charity case of Dr. Ryu. He doesn't have a lot of money, so Ryu goes and checks on him regularly, but he calls him to say, something's wrong with my neighbor. My neighbor has attempted to commit suicide. A couple of words about Joseph. He's somebody who Dr. Ryu winds up having a lot of esteem for. Even though he's, he's not a man who has accomplished great and fantastic things, but he's loved in his honesty. Actually, we're going to get to that a little bit later. It's part of one of the future slides. His neighbor, Monsieur Cotard, has attempted suicide. So they go over to check on Monsieur Cotard, who is in a state. obviously, having just tried to kill himself, Joseph heard something happening next door and heard a terrible groan and decided to burst in and see what was going on. And he found Monsieur Cotard hanging. And so got him down. Sorry?
Like a suicide note on the door or something like that.
Yes. He leaves a note, that's right, in red chalk that says, "I've hanged myself, come in." That's the note. Come on in, make yourself at home. Yeah, he borrowed the chalk from Joseph, who's trying to learn Latin. Joseph is desperate to learn to express himself better, which is something, don't worry, I haven't skipped that over. We're going to talk about that. It's definitely a big part of, it is the practically defining characteristic of Joseph's character, is that he wants to be able to express himself better. And he's writing a book. There's an irony there. Monsieur Cotard has attempted to get things over with. And he's like, don't call the police, please. I'd rather not. I just, I had a moment. I'm okay now. Everything's fine. Just don't call the police, please. Anybody want to say some things about Monsieur Cotard? It's okay if you spoil part of this part. What do we think is Mr. Cotard's... I would say there are really two possibilities for Monsieur Cotard.
Well, I thought the most meaningful thing was later on when it starts to talk about how life seems to take an upturn for him as things start to get bad around him.
Right, but that's always on a sort of teeter-totter, though, where he can also go into a fit of rage and be like, they're all against me. He starts... Okay, we'll get to that, but the things that he asks... Okay, actually, I do have a slide about it. I'm not going to push it for right now, but you have to say, okay, what is motivating this guy? Why did he kill himself? Or why did he kill himself? I killed myself. I've been murdered by me. Why did he attempt to kill himself? We'll get to that.
There are things he like asks you, if I'm correct, like whether you can get arrested if you're taken to a local hospital.
Yes.
I mean that hospital I was set up. So.
Yes, he always says weird. Mm-hmm, go on.
I mean that is also foreshadowing.
Yes. So yeah, he says weird little things, asks strange questions. He asks Dr. Ryu, if I were ill and I were in the hospital, could I be arrested if I were in there? He's also like, don't call the police. I don't like the police. When he starts being friendly, which we're going to talk about, as everything gets worse and worse, Cotard is just happy as a clam. He loves this whole thing. He turns all friendly. He becomes amicable, as Monsieur Grand says. Starts making friends. Starts tipping well. But then he says, these people are so nice. They'd make good witnesses. And Joseph says, what? Well, they could testify that I'm not a bad kind of guy, which is just a really weird thing to say. Hey, these people could be witnesses that I'm not a bad guy. Witnesses for whom? So yeah, we're getting all kinds of foreshadowing about Monsieur Cotard. We are going to have a slide about that soon. I kind of skipped ahead a little bit. So some things about Monsieur Grand. As I said, primary characteristic for him, he can't find the words. These are all quotes from the book, not statements by myself. Yeah, always seemed to have trouble finding his words, though he expressed himself in the simplest possible way. It even comes through in the quotes sometimes where he says, when talking about Monsieur Cotard's attempted suicide, he says something like, he chose hanging as a way to get it done. And I think it's really well written, where you see he pauses and he just says, get it done. Or something like that. Yeah, he showed an almost finical anxiety. Finical, if you guys have probably heard the adjective before, finicky, which means picky. So this is like a choosy anxiety over his choice of words. The only objects in his apartment were 2 or 3 dictionaries. Like, okay, Camus, we get it. A small blackboard where one could read just 2 half-obliterated words, flowery avenues. He also does this cutesy thing where he'll say something really hackneyed. Okay, here's a vocabulary moment for you guys who are practicing English. The word hackneyed or trite. Basically things that people say all the time. You know, like lost in dreams or pretty as a picture, as he says. So he'll say really hackneyed, trite phrases as he's talking. And he'll say, as we say where I come from. So here we go. Rue had already noticed Grand's trick of professing to quote some turn of speech, in other words, an idiomatic phrase or something, from his part of the world, and follow up with some hackneyed expression as lost in dreams. So it's as if I were to say, it is, as they say where I come from, raining cats and dogs, which is just a really common phrase. I'm going to, as we say where I come from, sit down. He said, okay, that's a really common phrase. Not even an idiom in that case. It's all expressed as kind of adorable. You can see that Ryu has a sort of esteem for Monsieur Grand. Yeah, he says it's the bane of his life. Oh, doctor, how I'd like to learn to express myself. Every time he meets Ryu, he says this, or something like it. But there are a good couple of paragraphs about how Joseph Grand, in his own way, is a sort of just exemplary person. Now, a couple of other background pieces on Monsieur Grand. He's a clerk. That's how he has access to all these statistics. In a lot of scenes, he's walking in with the latest numbers and saying, have you seen these numbers? And Ryu says, if you look at him, you could almost say he was born to be a clerk, which sounds like an insult. But he says, in a certain sense, it might well be said that his was an exemplary life. He was one of those rare people, rare in our town as elsewhere, who have the courage of their good feelings. So he describes further Joseph as a very sincere person who's very forthcoming. He tells the story of why he's lowly paid in his position. He was promised a promotion by the his previous manager, but that guy, I think, passed away, I think it says. And he could never bring himself to go argue with the new manager about it. First of all, because he couldn't remember the agreement. Second of all, he can't find the words, which is always his thing. And he didn't want to go in there talking about being owed a position because he felt that was really unseemly. So Monsieur Grand, all around good guy. At least that's how he's expressed by Dr. Ryu. We get some excerpts from Theroux's diary. So Dr. Ryu includes some other material to give other people's perspectives. And here we have, so Ryu basically reading the diary to you in an interesting turn of narration. And we meet the guy who spits on cats. So I wanted to include the guy who spits on cats because he is another example of what? Of absurdity, exactly. Every day, soon after lunch, at a time when most people stayed indoors enjoying a siesta, this guy comes out, calls for the cats, tears up some paper, throws it into the street, and the cats come out, and he spits at them. and he beams with delight every time he hits them. He's described as dapper. The guy dresses up for this. I don't know if you guys are familiar with David Lynch. This is the film director. It's a very Lynchian scene. A man who dresses up in a nice suit to go out on the balcony and spit at animals. It's, certainly not a nice thing to do, although the cats are probably not too terribly, they're probably, startled. It's not insanely cruel. It's not nice either. It's just extremely odd and out of place. And we get examples of the absurd happening throughout. Remember what I said about the absurd? Absurdity comes from not being in it. Like when you see the man shouting inside of the telephone booth, or the guy with the Bluetooth headphones gesticulating and arguing with someone. It looks absurd because you're not in the conversation. Maybe there is some reasonable explanation for the man who spits at cats. I was sitting down trying to think of one. It's not easy. And that's maybe he has family who are being held captive. Well, no, I guess he wouldn't be beaming with delight in that case. There must be some circumstance inside of his mind. It's certainly not absurd, right?
Maybe he's boredom. Maybe he's just bored.
It could be, but if you think about getting dressed up and spitting at animals as a reaction to boredom, that just furthers the absurdity of the situation. I mean, when he beams with delight, it doesn't say he pretends to beam with delight. He beams with delight. He is delighted. So there's some stage inside of his brain. His internal landscape is such that this is entertainment for him. Or it's something. Another thing that's very interesting from Theroux's diary is this brief aside. Throughout the diary, Theroux includes asides. An aside as a noun is just a small diversion, a digression from whatever's being talked about. There's an aside where Theroux suddenly writes, query, how contrive not to waste one's time? Contrive in this case doesn't mean pretend. It's something more like engineer. Contrive can be used to mean fake. Like, oh, that's so contrived means that it's so forced or something like that. But in this case, it means something like how to engineer your life in such a way as to not waste one's time. And here's the answer he gives. By being fully aware of it all the while. So this is really just in that realm of the absurd. Ways in which this can be done. By spending one's days on an uneasy chair in a dentist's waiting room. By remaining on one's balcony all Sunday afternoon. By listening to lectures in a language one doesn't know. By traveling by the longest and least convenient train routes. And of course, standing all the way. Yes, of course. By lining up at the box office of theaters and then not buying a seat. And so forth. And, itakodaye, like things like that. It's pretty amusing. And it's funny because, not all of them are good examples of where you would be fully aware. I mean, I think standing in line to buy tickets and then not buying the ticket is probably a good one because you know that you're not going to buy a ticket the whole time. So that makes you aware of the fact that you're standing in line. But if you're just, I don't know, or if you're on the balcony all Sunday, you might just start daydreaming or something. But here's the thing. His solution to not wasting time is not that you should do something quote unquote productive. What does waste one's time mean? Well, to Theroux, waste one's time means that you let some time slip by that you didn't notice. That's wasted time. It's not that you need to be doing something not wasteful. I'm not making any judgments about what's wasteful or productive here. Taru is going to just say, as long as you were aware of the time that you spent, then you didn't waste it. Which is a very interesting take. It's an almost Buddhist take, perhaps. Anybody want to say anything about this?
Yeah, it reminds me of what's his face from the Beatles, whose name I can't remember. John Lennon. There it is. The
Vladimir Lenin.
Yes, old Vladdy.
Yeah, this sounds like something a Beatle could say. So yeah,
I did want to say, like, this list of activities, because I had this before, like, looking at the study guide or anything, and I was like, the whole time I was just thinking, instead of about the occupation, I was thinking about the Holocaust.
Mm-hmm.
And I was looking at this list of, can you hear me?
Yeah, you're there.
Okay, anyway, I was just thinking about that list of activities, and trying to relate it to the plight of the Jewish people during the Second World War. And I was thinking about, like, that train ride or listening to a lecture in a language you don't understand, and stuff like that.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. If you were carted off in a train to Poland and there were public announcements being made in Polish that you didn't understand. Yeah.
And I was sort of thinking, like, people in those situations were probably very aware of their time.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah, sort of how I felt while I was reading that part.
A thing that, in places that Camus and Sartre agree, let's say, there's this thing about how during the occupation, they say we were more free than ever. Now that sounds really counterintuitive, but the way that Sartre would put it is that every time you walk outside and you see that Nazi guard, holding a rifle on the corner, you become aware of the decision. You have to either put your head down and keep walking or decide to do something about it. And you're constantly confronted with that. So yeah, I mean, that kind of relates to this, you're constantly confronted by the lecture in a language you don't understand, or standing up on the train on a very long and obviously terrifying trip. Okay, let's go on to the next here. So some of Ryu's musings. Guys, musings are just reflections. These are the parts of the book in which Ryu is speaking to you directly. I picked out some of the more important ones. This quote, the first one here, there have been as many plagues as wars in history, yet plagues and wars take people equally by surprise, is probably one of the more discussed quotes in the book out there in the world. In fact, I mentioned that Camus came in for some criticism from some of his contemporaries. One of the criticisms was from Simone de Beauvoir, who said, it's not right for you to basically push aside the agency or the decision that the Germans made. It's not like the Germans were just a force of nature. There's a lot to discuss there. We're not going to totally get into that right now. I don't know if we would have time or even come to a conclusion on that. But, I think that he, or at least Sartre, would say something like, right, but there are sort of like bad ideologies. People can be, let's say, motivated to act based on identities that they believe themselves to possess. Let me make that less confusing. Some guy does something and then says, if someone asks him, why did you do that? And he says, because I'm a man. So Sartre in particular would call that living in bad faith, which means it's not that you reacted to a sort of patterned way of interpreting the world. So living in bad faith means that you take on an identity and you just behave that identity. You act out the identity. And that's
kind of like the Stanford experiment.
Sorry?
Isn't that kind of relevant to Stanford prison experiment and that theory? Because I know it was some kind of correlated to like how the old Germans supported Nazi, how
yeah, I would actually avoid using that example because I don't know if you've read that there are some recent developments on why there should be some skepticism about that particular experiment. But when it comes to the explanations given by concentration camp guards, basically executioners, yes, absolutely. It is denial of one's own choice. I was just doing my job is one version of that. But this particular group of thinkers would say that actually extends almost all the way down to the very bottom of the person. Because at the very base of the person is free will. They're strong believers in free will. And you kind of paper over that free will with all of these things, all of these behaviors, because the most terrifying thing is the choice that you have to make all the time. So people, in order to escape making a choice, kind of just take on these ideas, and that it's a shortcut to thinking about the choice that they have to make. And that's, I actually don't want to get Camus' response to Simone de Beauvoir wrong. So I'm not going to say what it is. I think it's something like that. He does respond to her. He responds to a few people. Some people he didn't bother responding to because, well, let's not get into that. But yes, this is a very clear line drawn between the plague and the war. When a war breaks out, people say, it's too stupid, it can't last long. But though a war may be too stupid, it still lasts. Here's a good quote. Stupidity has a knack of getting its way. Mm-hmm.
I love that quote.
Yeah.
That's my favorite.
Yeah.
It reminds me of, it's not Occam's razor. There's another razor that I can't remember the name of. But it's always like, don't assume ill intent, just assume stupidity or ignorance, incompetence. Yeah.
Yeah, don't assume ill intent when incompetence will suffice, something like that. Yeah, I can't remember what that's called. Yes, stupidity indeed has a knack of getting its way, as we should see if we were not always so wrapped up in ourselves. In this same part in chapter 5, same chapter, we get a bit of Rieu's coldness, where he's just thinking about the numbers and thinking about historical plagues and the millions and millions of people. And he's thinking about it in a very cold way and realizing like regular people can't understand that. He's a doctor. He's seen a lot of death already, in his career. And he says to himself, well, says to you, 10,000 dead, made about 5 times the audience in a biggish cinema. Yes, that's how it should be done. You should collect the people at the exits of 5 picture houses. You should lead them to a city square and make them die in heaps, like piles. If you guys don't know a heap, it's like gomila. If you want to get a clear notion of what it means, then you could add some familiar faces to the anonymous mass. So this is about the impersonality or the impersonal nature of statistics, right? The famous Stalin quote about the death of 1 million people or millions of people is a statistic. The death of one person is a tragedy. He's trying to think of how could we get people to realize the potential immense tragedy that is just ahead of us. It's not enough to tell them the numbers. They need to realize those numbers in concrete terms, seeing the faces of people. Then he thinks forward to his next day, his daily round. So the daily round is where he goes and sees his regulars. There lay certitude. So he comes out of his musings, all the rest hung on mere threads and trivial contingencies. The thing to do was your job. So this is very essential to his character. The thing was to do your job as it should be done. We're going to speak on that more as we proceed through this story, because it's certainly something that comes up a lot. The motivations for people are very, very important here. We get to the prefect's office. This is where Ryu is trying to express the urgency of the situation. Two of his colleagues, Richard, is the head of the medical association in town, and Castell is an old colleague who's an older doctor. Castell is convinced that it's a very bad situation. The rats have multiplied and multiplied and multiplied. Well, the rat bodies, that is. Castell says, the question, by the way, this part that's not in italics, that's me speaking, quibbling over terms. It's really interesting. These guys do not want to use the word plague. That's the most important thing for them. Don't use that word. The question is to know whether it's the plague or not. 2 or 3 of the doctors protest immediately. The others hesitate. The prefect, that's like the colonial director, okay, director of the colony, gave a start. If you guys don't know that idiom, it means he jumped. To give a start means to be startled. And hurriedly glanced toward the door. He wants to make sure nobody heard the word. Richard is the one who is trying to put the brakes on anything serious happening. And we get some great examples here of really faulty logic when Richard makes his case. So he says it's a mistake to paint too gloomy a picture. Also, the disease hasn't been proved to be contagious. In fact, relatives of his parents had escaped it. But others have died, says Ryu. Ryu always responds very simply and very straightforwardly. They keep trying to pin him down. Oh, so you're saying it's the plague? He's like, no, I said, this is what I've seen. And he just reports. We always get another thing we should have added to that list of characteristics for Ryu is that he makes all efforts to be objective. Richard, summing up the situation as he saw it, do you guys hear me? Sounds okay. As he saw it, pointed out that if the epidemic did not cease spontaneously, it would be necessary to apply the rigorous prophylactic, is that word in Serbian? It's prophylactics are safety equipment, like rubber gloves and so on. Protective, basically. Protective measures laid down in the code, presumably a medical code, or a procedural code for the colony. And to do this, it would be necessary to admit that the plague had broken out. But of this, there's no absolute certainty. Therefore, we should not say that it's the plague, is basically what he's saying. He's saying, whoa, not too fast. We'll have to admit that there's a plague in order to start doing the rigorous measures. So this is not even circular reasoning. It's almost like ignoratio elenchi, Scott, if you remember. It's the only premise in this argument that's connected to this conclusion. The conclusion is any hasty action was to be deprecated. Deprecated means devalued. In other words, we should not look positively on any hasty action. The only connected premise to that is there is no certainty. All these other ones are almost disconnected from the conclusion. It's an irrelevant conclusion to say, we would have to admit there's a plague. all of it comes back to just not wanting to say that it's a plague. It comes to this. This is the conclusion they come to. We are to take responsibility. Okay, to Richard's credit, he does give way eventually. He says, we're to take the responsibility of acting as though the epidemic were a plague. Okay, we're going to act as though the epidemic were a plague. This way of putting it met with general approval. It doesn't matter to me, Rio said, how you phrase it. My point is that we should act as if there were no likelihood, which we should not act as if there's no likelihood that half the population will be wiped out, for then it would be. This, of course, just upsets them again. So there's a lot of quibbling over the wording. So this is pretty well connected to how words are really important here. It's connected to Joseph and his inability to find the right words. So words are put forward as powerful things all the time in this story. Does anybody want to make any comments about this? Okay. We go on to the final chapter in this part. I want to talk about Cotard on the mend, as in he's recovering after his attempted suicide. Cotard, as we said, has a complete change of character. He stopped taking visitors. Instead, he started going out. He's trying to make friends with everyone. To the grocer, he was all affability. That's friendliness. No one could take more pains than he to show interest in the tobacconist gossip. The tobacconist is also characterized as a difficult lady to interact with. And he's like, no, you just have to get to know her. Here's where he says one of those weird things. One day when the head waiter had escorted him to the door and helped him into his overcoat, Cotard said to Grand, he's a nice fellow, and he'd make a good witness. A witness? I don't follow. He could say I'm not a bad kind of man. So we keep getting these allusions to, I don't know, he feels like he's going to be on trial. So this is what I was trying to hint at earlier in this discussion. Cotard is one of two things. He's either a criminal or he's a paranoiac. That's also possible. He could just be crazy. Okay, that's not the right term. Don't cancel me. He could just be a paranoid person who thinks that people are out to get him. At another point, he says, they're all in it together. They're all out to get me. And doesn't really elaborate. These are mostly from the reports of Joseph, who has started hanging out with him. And yes, here is that indication of the stranger. So there's another book by Camus. Many of you probably know this already, called The Stranger. And in that story, another Frenchman in Algeria murders a man on the beach, an Arab man. And we might get into some talk about The Stranger a little bit in another session. Suffice it to say that he gets arrested and kind of has to he starts off being a person with no real feelings about anything, actually. He's just a kind of blank slate. He's a person who is really an object being pushed around by the weather and whatever is happening at the moment. And this leads him to a murder. But this is an allusion to The Stranger. A young commercial employee had killed an Algerian on a beach. I always say this is the woman is the tobacconist. The woman began, if they clapped all that scum in jail, decent folks could breathe more freely. She was too much startled by Cotard's reaction. He dashed out of the shop without a word of excuse. So he hears about a crime being committed and he runs away, which is pretty wild. I mean, that almost sounds more like a paranoid person than a criminal. I mean,
I read it. Sorry, I read it as him running away to clapping all the scum in jail.
Oh, really?
Like,
That's
yeah,
an
that's how
interesting
I
take.
read it. Yeah. Like, oh, she wants to get me in jail too.
Oh, okay. No, I thought you meant that he was running out to start putting people in jail. I was like,
No,
that's
no.
an
I
interesting
mean,
take.
like
Uh,
he's nervous because, well, this is like supports the criminal idea, and he's nervous because, oh, I'm a criminal and she wants all the scum to go to jail, and
right.
that's why
And I
he
think that,
ran
yeah,
out.
no, I see that too. I just find it very strange that it's not, okay, if somebody is a criminal who has, I don't know, shot someone, and then someone says, hey, they should shoot people who, or sorry, they should lock up people who shoot people. And then the person runs away. It's just a bit of a strange reaction. It seems likely that a like regular criminal would be like, yeah, totally. It's a strange reaction, in my view. I don't know. Anybody else want to say anything about this? Okay. Oops. Uh, yeah, Cotard asks Ryu if a person in a hospital can be arrested. Just wondering. Ryu said, it's been known to happen, but it all depends on the invalid's condition. Now, the whole thing, though, is that since his suicide attempt, things have really started going downhill in the town. And as the town goes downhill, Cotard goes uphill, although he's likely to go into a fit of rage for weird reasons. But he seems to be having a good time. He totally changes. He starts going to the cafes, as we said. He starts reading the conservative newspaper, which is a weird detail to put in. It said before he was a sort of font or an adherent to liberal ideals. He would always say, for example, the big fish eats the little fish. So they're talking about, I guess, concept of economic liberalism. But then he became a conservative. So it's an interesting way of looking at this character. He kind of, okay, he and the Crazy Spaniard are people who kind of welcome the chaos in a way. When he's asked what the town needs, he says an earthquake, a big one. So this is his earthquake. He's glad to see everything getting shaken up for whatever reason. Maybe these are opportunistic reasons. He wants to preserve himself by hiding in the chaos. That could be it. Or he just likes the chaotic environment. It's kind of an open question, and it will continue to be. We can make more. Go on.
Maybe with all the chaos that's happening in the town, he thinks that he can hide, and
yeah,
he thinks that he will not be in danger because no one will pay attention to him with all happenings in town.
Yeah, he feels much more at home. That's why he goes out now. He's like, oh, the police are probably really busy now dealing with all the chaos. Yeah. He can hide in all the madness. By the way, is it in this chapter or in this section of the book that I think it is where Ryu talks about other people in town? It's like men who considered themselves Don Juans became the exemplar of fidelity to their wives. Is that, maybe that's in the second part? I can't remember. So it happens to other people too. Like the guy who never paid attention to his mother suddenly is doting on her and tending to her every need. People get reminded of their temporality. But that, I wouldn't say that that's what's happening with Cotard. He's like, oh, we're all mortal. I need to. That's why I don't see this as a. Okay, well, maybe I shouldn't say anything because you guys should read first. I would say maybe be a little suspicious of whether this is some kind of reformation of Cotard, like he's turning into a good person because of all the terrible things that are happening. Maybe. Okay. So yes, finally, things are really going to hell. They're finding thousands of dead rats. More and more people are dying. And I should have mentioned in one of these slides, they put up half measures, some signs around town that are like, hey guys, maybe you should wash your hands or something. I don't know. Very weak measures around town. Okay, so that actually happened in some places. See, there are some things that you might find familiar. Just sort of suggestions. If somebody in your house gets sick, maybe just avoid them for a little while. Very weak measures were given. But now things are getting crazy. And the prefect says, I'll ask our government for orders. This upsets Ryu a lot. The prefect's remark was still rankling, still like echoing in his head, bothering him. Orders, he said scornfully. What's needed is imagination. We're going to find out more about what that means in our next episode. So yes, in the end, at the end of the first part of the book, it finally gets through to the people in charge that much stricter measures must be taken. And so the town is quarantined. So the telegram that they get from, I guess, Paris, they finally got alarmed. Proclaim a state of plague. Stop. Close the town. That stop, by the way, is the stop that you get in telegrams. I don't know if you guys are familiar with that. It's meant to be a full stop on the telegram message. In other words, proclaim a state of plague, full stop, close the town, full stop. Okay. So this is the first part of the book. I've included more illustrations. Anybody have things that they'd like to say about this first part? Something that I didn't get to? Of course, there are. We can't cover every single detail, but I want you to feel free to bring up some details that I may not have discussed.
I want to say something.
Okay.
There was this part when I found actually a quote when Richard says, sorry, but I can't do anything about it. In order to that effect can be issued only by the prefect. And
By the prefect.
kind of relevant to the situation that's happening in our country. Like, regardless, the doctor says that some measures might be good for the situation. Like the president and the others just don't want to listen to them.
Yes.
Yes, it's kind of relevant because you said the last class that maybe we'll see some relevance in our situation now in the book. So yeah.
Absolutely. Yes. That's not just here in Serbia. That's in the US too. Experts are being ignored left and right. I don't know. If we had more time, I'd like to try to do a devil's advocate thing. You know, somebody might say, yeah, we can't just close down the whole town every time someone gets a cold. Okay, look, it's not my position that I would be taking in that argument, thus the devil's advocate part, but maybe we'll do that next time. Yeah, you're gonna find more people that sound really familiar, even sometimes discussions and almost word for word conversations in a way. You'll see what I mean. Okay, so that's the first part. I wanted to talk about this comic for a second. Well, actually, I'll include it in the next slideshow as well. This comic artist, Tom Gold, he does comics that are cutesy and sometimes have philosophical content. This is one of them. It's one of my favorites, and it has to do with what motivates people, as if you could look into yourself and see why you did something, or someone could ask you. If you want to take a second and read it, I feel silly reading it to you. Very quick comic. We're going to continue discussing what motivates people. It's going to be a direct topic of the next section of the book. Why are you helping? Why aren't you helping? You know, in those news bits where they ask or they say to the person, thank you for doing that, the right thing. And the person says, I just did what any person would do. That's kind of, if somebody asked that person, why did you do that? Well, I just did what any person would do. That's kind of like Ryu's position. Okay, I don't want to spoil it though. It's a better question to ask someone who didn't do something, why didn't you do something? In any case, Robot Bully is able to tell you directly by simply looking inside of himself and printing his intentions onto paper so that you can read them and say, oh, okay. So this is an example of people earlier we talked about how people act out, okay, in this way of thinking, people act out identities or act out things that are inside of them, existing all at once like a rock, so that they can say, well, I didn't have a choice. Robot Bully doesn't have a choice. It's just the way that he is. There's something inside of him, and he can show you on paper. In case there's any confusion, you get to see. Okay. So for next time, the second part is a little bit longer. So you don't have to read the whole thing, but you should read through chapter 15. You can see what chapter 15 is by looking at the study guide. Basically, we're going to try to stick around 60 pages per session. If you want to read ahead, absolutely feel free to. I don't want to stop you. But you should check out at least the next, this is approximately 60 pages here. Okay. Anybody have anything else to add?
No.
All right. And again, if you have any other things that you want to discuss related to this, even, oh, somebody's chatting. Let me see here. Just a sec. Oh, thank you. Thank you, Milica. I'm glad you enjoyed it. I hope to see you all next week. Keep yourself in the book. And yeah, if you want to, excuse me, I'm losing my voice. If you want to send me something to include in the slideshow for discussion, I am absolutely open to that. Like, just, you know, make sure you send it on time, though. Don't send it the day of or day before. Give me at least a day or two. Yeah, I mean, it's this is the first successful book club I've managed to run. I made a couple of attempts before and just had a hard time getting enough people to consistently show up. But you know, you can't help but realize that there's so much in there that's open to analysis that you really can't hit everything. So I kind of tend to take out things that made a big impression to me and things that are, let's say, considered academically important. But anything you guys want to discuss, let's discuss it. Okay, well, that's it for now then. I'll see you guys next week at the same time.
Okay.
All right.
See you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye. See you.
Bye.